Morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you, and I do want to join you, invite you to join a table with others. We're going to do introductions, and talking to yourself is just going to be, like what we do all the time in our heads. But it'd be much nicer if you could meet somebody else who's here. So join a table. 5, 6 people around the table is wonderful. So. In fact, what I want to start with is that introduction. But let me just very briefly say, my work is mostly focused on climate change. Yours might not be, and that's totally fine. I think what I'm going to try to explain to you in this workshop are principles and approaches and step-by-step ways of getting to metrics of success or of progress. So don't feel like you have to have that as your focal point. I think you're still going to gain a lot from this workshop. But if I keep slipping into talking about resilience or climate adaptation or something, that's because that's what I do. All right, so with introductions, let's just start. If you want to just introduce yourselves at your tables, name, pronouns, whatever you want to share your affiliation, and then one thing in your work that you wish you knew, whether it's succeeding, whether it's working. So just talk amongst yourselves. All right, I see the tables calming down. So let me just take you to the next step. And this is a workshop. I don't know if you saw that in the announcement. Kristen sent it around a few times. If you have your laptops, your Padlets, your somethings present, even your phones will work for this next thing. So I'm going to ask you to either use your camera to get to this Menti, or you can open a browser, enter menti.com, and then put in this code, 25 26 46 56. 25 26 46 56. All right, and I'm going to go over to the browser. Hang on. Yes, this is, I believe, the first slide. See all what comes up here on this question. Resilient is obviously top of mind, which is why you're here, but look at these things. Anything from safety to health, community, less flooding, sustainability, safe housing, sustainability, water quality, thriving, community, save the planet, quality of life, youth leadership. Yeah, that was inspiring this morning, wasn't it? So you can see this is kind of what this group here is all wishing for their efforts to come out as. And of course, one big question is, how do we know? How do we move in that direction, right? This is what this session is all about. Let me move us to the next slide. Hang on a second here. Hang on 1 second. I need to quickly check something. Hang on. Here we are. Actually, I want to, let me start you here. That's actually way more interesting at the moment. We'll come back to the other one. What is your role in building resilience or adaptation, or maybe in restoration, whatever, conservation? What are your, what is the most appropriate thing that describes what you do? Are you a project manager, maybe a program manager, elected person, someone who's simply affected by whatever somebody else does, or you're just here because you're interested? So majority of the people in the room are actually working on these sorts of things, right? Or managing programs to make resilience happen in one way or another. Great. So from here, what is the most important to you about measuring progress or success of your efforts? Why do you want to do it? Like, why do you care? What brought you here? Why do you want to know? What is most important to you about measuring progress? To keep the funding flowing, to see the impact, to ensure we're having the desired impact, build community support, being transparent, having people support the goals of restoration, guide future investment. Yeah, so there's some really interesting differences, complementarities, efficiency, sustainability, adaptive management, make sure our grant funding is effective, justify funding, see what can be scaled, learn, proof that the efforts we're making makes a difference, and on it goes, right? So quite a variety, and we'll come back to those. I think you're going to find yourself in good company. Let me ask you one more. To what extent do you already measure progress or success? So one, I have developed metrics, but it's not adequate. We're pros at measuring progress and success. We just started and need some good ideas and guidance. We're planning to do it, or we have not yet gotten started. So majority of you have developed metrics, but it's not adequate. Well, it'll be really interesting to hear more from you later, why you think so. The other part is we just started and need some good ideas and guidance. So hopefully we get there. Okay, we're going to stop here for the moment. I'm going to take you back to my slides. Hang on, here we are. And give you an outline of what we want to do this morning. So I'm going to share with you what I've learned over maybe 20 years now, close to 20 years of doing this work with measuring progress, figuring out what success means, why people care. And I think you're going to find yourself quite resonant with that. And then talk about like, what is it exactly that we're trying to track? How do we go about it? I'll give you a little bit of background. I'll explore with you a toolkit in which you can actually, it guides you through the steps of developing your own metrics. And I'm going to share with you a couple of examples, quite different. And then, you know, we end with, so like, why bother? So what? What's the best use of that? And how do we move forward? So let me start with that. The common motivations that I've found. This is kind of like how it usually starts, right? How can we show someone important, maybe an elected official or a funder or somebody, that we're doing what we so overambitiously promise that we actually are doing, right? That's typically what brings us to measuring. Or, and this is, I think, if we're honest, also often true, can someone find, and if necessary, fudge the data to show we're already doing it? I think there's some levels of government that are particularly good at this right now. But, you know, we're all in this, right? Because we somehow need to essentially show that the funding that we got is, or the people who voted us into office or whatever, are actually agreeing, or we're doing what they wanted us to do. And then, you know, if you're actually shifting between administrations or you're shifting from one way of doing it to now a new way, like how do you actually bring these things together, and can you demonstrate that to folks? But I think in most of the cases, it is something like, what can I tell whoever you are talking to about the impact of all the time and money that we spent building resilience? I have in my head oftentimes this conversation with a president that might care about resilience saying, okay, we invested billions and billions of dollars in resilience. Is America better off now? What would I say? What would I point to other than, oh, here's a good example, or here's one example, but how do I actually demonstrate that, right? That's sort of in my head what I'm often thinking about. Over all the years that I've worked on it, people tend to have these 5 reasons of why they do it. And I saw it in all of what you said in your Menti. For one thing, it's about communication and engagement. If you cannot talk about what you're doing, leading with a compelling vision of success, and then showing how you're moving toward it, you're going to lose your audience really fast, right? So, or take the example of, there's 5 departments or 5 organizations that need to work together. What are we working together toward, right? Are we all just doing our own thing? Well, that's not going to come and bring the success that you want. It's like having a shared vision and bringing people along to it and knowing, okay, we're all contributing toward this goal. Those are really important reasons to know what you're doing. Another one is to help inform deliberate planning and decision making. Okay, we're doing this now because we want to get here, to justify that and show people you're actually moving in that direction. A third one, I saw that quite a few times pop up in the Mentimeter, is justifying adaptation expenditures. Why do you want to raise the taxes or, have a fund or even apply for a grant or something like that? You always need to show that here's what we're aiming for and here's how you have used that money. And so that gets to the last one, the fourth one about accountability and good governance. Even if something doesn't fully succeed, you want to show we've pursued, this with adequate processes. We have followed the rules. We have used the priority criteria you said, and still we didn't quite get there because. What's the because? You have to have an answer to that. And that often comes with, measuring the context, looking at your project, what went wrong, what went right, to explain. People are actually able to live, if you will, with something that didn't quite achieve the full outcome that you hoped if you can explain it well. And this is what this gets at. And then the last one, and it's actually interesting, in this case, you would be interested in failure too, right? Not just success, but what went wrong? Why did it go wrong, right? And what do we need to look at in order to explain that? So supporting your learning and doing things differently next time. I think we heard that this morning on the panel quite a bit, right? Let's not keep making the same mistakes, but learn from that and change how we move forward. So this is really why I got into this and why a lot of you are interested in this. So I want you to think about for a moment at whatever the challenges that you're looking at, what is it actually that we're trying to manage? If you have one way to think about it, or one option, I guess, is it a complicated thing where you have many parts, each one of them is knowable, expert solvable. An example might be, building a bridge, right? Building a seawall, if you will. An approach to that, to really address that adequately, is to diagnose it correctly, find the right expert, apply the right method and tool, get the right answer. That's what a complicated problem is. The alternative is a complex challenge. It's emergent. You can, even if you know as much as you want to know about any one piece, it's in some sense irreducible. There's always uncertainty. It's always evolving, always changing. There's no one solution. I think in New England we call those wicket problems, right? Ecosystems are like that. They're alive. They're constantly evolving. So if you do something on this side, it'll change it over here, right? Culture, that's that's its own beast. Think about climate change or climate change adaptation. In other words, there is no one single solution for it. You can try something, you can learn from it, adapt depending on that, and maybe over time use all of the people in the room to maybe make sense. I love the example of this morning's engagement, right, where they brought 80 tribal leaders together, and yes, everyone contributed to understanding what this river is about. It's not just about a bunch of water flowing downstream. It's not just a bunch of species, right? It's a whole cultural significance of that, the history of it, and so on. So I want you to go back to the Menti in a moment to think about, if resilience building is a complex challenge, what does that actually mean for us? It typically means, and probably you've experienced this, that if you try to solve one aspect of it, you get 2 more problems. You have to understand the context You can't intervene effectively. It's not an isolated, thing that you can just like tighten the screw a little bit here or do something, mechanical intervention. It keeps changing and requires ongoing sensing, sense-making, willingness to learn. You typically can't solve it alone, but you need everyone's intelligence, everyone's knowledge to understand it. Your old tools, the ones you use to deal with complicated problems, may not even work. The timing is typically important. Like, if you want to say protect your coastline from sea level rise or from coastal storms, well, it doesn't help if you do that a year after the storm, right? If you wanted to protect it, you need that in place before, right? Or if you, I don't know, elevate people above the floodplain or whatever, right? It's really important that everyone contributes to that example beforehand. So it's a good solution, but implemented at the wrong time makes it an ineffective or wrong or not adequate solution. So, and so on and so on. The point I'm trying to make here is we're dealing with a really challenging beast, right? It's not as simple. If it was just a matter of, oh, can I just build this and know how it functions and then we're done, I don't think you would be here. It would be very simple. Everyone would know what the right measures are, the right metrics are, and you would all be, just give me the catalog. That's all it is. But each of you work in unique contexts where you have to figure it out, what works here. So, sounds a little bit like this to me. We're all, if you will, dealing with this multi-headed beast. And what I love about this, it's not just about Hercules, right? It's a whole bunch of other people working, but you have to have that situational awareness. Who's doing what over here? And how is that helping or hindering, right? So it's kind of like that to keep in mind. So I want you to talk a little bit in your groups at first. If this is what we're dealing with, and you have very unique circumstances, what is most important then to pay attention to and to track, if this is what we're dealing with? Okay, so if you have a complex issue, what would be the most important to track? Discuss. I want us to go back to the Mentimeter for a moment, and I'm just going to ask you to share a little bit out from every one of the tables. Hang on, let me get to the next slide. What are some of the themes that you're hearing? I know you have very specific projects, but what are you, when you think back to this common themes shared around your tables, what are some of the things that you feel are most important to track when you deal with complex problems? The goals. What is this about? Yeah, where are you headed? The timescales, interesting. Perceptions. Funding. Continued monitoring, social resiliency, partners, the buy-in. All right. The scope. Oh, I love what you're saying. Community concerns, engaging people. Those who are entering perception, can you say more about what perception of what? Just so I understand what that refers to. Yes? Oh, we need to probably bring you. Oh, thank you so much, Kristen.
Yeah, I guess a little context to perception. I put it there because as you can talk, there's like two sides to a story, and a lot of times there's maybe 4 or 5 sides based on the different stakeholders. I think I put perception because it ties to the communications and seeing and kind of grappling with where is everybody.
Right.
We discussed a project that was kind of dear to me in my undergraduate career, which was at URI. Which was down in Matunic. There was a beach road as well as a bar and residential properties. There's a lot of different perceptions of what should be done for resilience strategies.
Yeah.
You know, as a college student, yeah, let's save the beach bar. But, you know, now entering, you know, a professional career, there is a huge tie to the emergency services that need to be put down there. And if a huge nor'easter hits the area, how are people going to leave their homes that have been there for 30 plus years? That, you know, so it's perception.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So both the problem perception and the goal perception, like what would we actually consider success, right? It's quite subjective, or at least it has multiple dimensions to it. Anything else? Let's see, what else? Obviously, community engagement really came up, cooperation. A lot of things I hear here about the process, you know, how do we actually get there, right? But there are lots of other things. Which kind of methods to use? Sorry, my glasses are not doing anymore. But you know, it's really interesting to me what's coming up to the top here. Having community support, which is really interesting to me, right? It's so often we think it's like, well, it's just the outcome that matters. No, you have to have the community come along, or else, you know, you can have the greatest project, but if nobody likes it, good luck to you, right? It's not happening. So I think what you're all saying here is that there are multiple things that we need to look at. One of the really important thing that comes for me out of community engagement is also keeping the relationship, you know, to the people who are affected, to people who are making the decisions, hearing from all different sides, right? To look at this hydra, the multi-headed beast from multiple perspectives. So really appreciate all these comments. So let's go back to this piece here. And I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about, we just did that, what I've learned over time about how people think about adaptation success. And I think you will very much resonate with this. So I've started to work on this probably in the mid-20-teens. At the time I was on the West Coast, and we had an opportunity to basically get people like yourselves in a room to say, what would success mean to you? Right? What are the important pieces from that? And the project actually grew out of people like yourselves coming up to me, say, how do we know it's working? How do we know I'm moving in the right direction? At the same time, I was starting to look like, what do we know about that? Has anybody written about this? And this ended up in a book. And then the more we started to look into this, people said, we want to actually know, tell me the metrics. How do I get to my metrics and how do I measure it? So we worked with the 5 different reserves from the reserve system, and then developed this toolkit, which I'm going to introduce to you in a moment. But here is what people basically came up with. And this is a lot to take in. I'm going to walk you through it in a moment. What's important about it, we lovingly call it the success hamburger. But the important piece about this is that people basically argued that if any one of those 6 dimensions that are depicted in this were missing, you wouldn't know whether you're actually moving in the right direction. In other words, each one is necessary but insufficient by itself. So the first one that you also very much emphasize is the process. How are we doing this? How are we going about this? How are we planning? And then, are we making good decisions? And people have a tendency, you know, to actually know. You use good science, you know, are transparent. That came up in the Mentimeter. So how are we making the decisions? Are we actually taking any steps? I mean, we've studied adaptation or any one of these problems to death, right? We have tons and tons of studies, and they absolutely go nowhere. Well, they're important, but it's not enough to just do the studies. You also then actually need to take a step. And what is it actually achieving? Obviously, right? Are we getting closer to what we want? And some of that may take, someone mentioned timescales, might take a while before it actually shows up as success. And at every one of those steps, you need to have people who know what they're doing, have the capacity, have the funding, have the skills, and you have to work toward overcoming the barriers. So all great if you have all this in place and you don't get any funding, if you don't have any political support, if you don't have the community support, right? All of those things are important in order for you to know, yes, we're not there yet, but we're moving in the right direction. So basically keep that in mind as, just categorically when you think about what metrics do I want, probably some of each to kind of have a good feel on where the beast is moving. Then there is the question of, and this is a little bit related, but not entirely related to the issue of perception that you brought up, which is, on the one hand, we want adaptation typically, when I ask people, is to, sorry, let me put all of these up so you see the whole thing. Most people, the first thing they want from an adaptation project or a conservation project or a restoration project is to make things better. Right? If you ask, what do I want? I want to fix all the problems we have. So that's what ideally doing better or making things better is about. At a minimum, if I can't make it better, at least keep it the way it is. That's what most people subjectively want from an adaptation or any project, really. And if that's not possible, give me a feasible way out, which is not great, right? We don't necessarily want to leave, even though in that hierarchy that, Kristen, you put up earlier, leaving the place that is at risk or in harm's way, whatever, is higher. But emotionally, not. Financially, it's not what we want to do. We want to actually stay in place, right? So, but if I can't make it better, if I can't, keep it the way it is and I have to leave, help me at least get out of the way in a good way. You can do a terrible process, you can abandon people, you can just, without any clear process, just no longer maintain infrastructure and make people's lives miserable, like that kind of stuff, right? You could do that. That's not what we're talking about. People can accept, and there's many examples around the country, New Jersey being one good case, where they've actually worked out a process of helping people move away from storm-impacted areas that flood again and again, and it's possible. And it can be perceived as a success, even when you don't get to stay, right? So anyway, it's a spectrum along the way. So, maybe you start on the right-hand side of this, and eventually you might have to move to the left-hand side of this. But each one can actually be successfully done. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail. I simply want to acknowledge that there are many, many buckets of reasons of why this is hard. It's probably for some of the reasons listed on this list is why you're here. Either you don't have the capacity to do it. It's absolutely real. Maybe you don't have the funding. Maybe you don't know what to measure. Maybe there aren't good methods to it. When should I measure? I mean, there's tons of questions, right? Which is why we basically worked with these communities to say, if we tried to do it, how would we do it well? Or at least as well as we can. The dots that are in red are the 5 reserves that we worked with, and you can easily see since very different types of physical environments, ecological environments. Alaska, very different situation than, say, Southern California at the Mexican border. But you get the idea. And each one was in different stages, if you will, and different challenges. I'll just quickly say, in Wells, the NEARS there had started to track what local communities are doing about adaptation. Are they changing land use laws? Are they changing culvert sizes? What are they actually doing? It was a really interesting case because it started a kind of competition among communities. Ooh, Wells is doing that? Well, Kenny Bunkport, now he's better catch up, that kind of sort of social competition in a good way. In New Jersey, this is in the mid-2010s, they had just lived through Sandy. And they wanted to know after what they had done to recover from that, are we now better off than before, right? So it's very contextualized kind of situations in which we tried this. In California, it was more like, can we get the region to agree what we're doing here? That was, both on the reserve, but also more regionally, can we come to an agreement? So very different situation where we tested this. And here's a few things that we learned. It is difficult time intensive, it's subjective, as you already said, and it is absolutely political to talk about, what a success is and what not, right? All of you who are elected officials, you know this. I don't need to tell you this. But, we sometimes come to this issue as if the indicators are apolitical and we don't need to, we can avoid the politics of this. No, they're not. You're absolutely in the middle of it with your indicators. Maybe you need multiple ones and have these processes that you already mentioned to discuss them. There is a tendency for most people to just simply track what's being done. We have done this, we have done this, we have done this, we've done this study, we've done this report, we have applied for this, and never do you know whether any of that actually made a diddly bit of a difference on the ground, right? Because it's so much harder to track process or outcomes. So that's one of the things that we noticed. And if you remember the sandwich, the hamburger, it's just one of 6 dimensions. So really, expanding the portfolio is important. Oftentimes what people, just simply out of necessity, tend to do is to start with measuring what they already measure. Makes a lot of sense because that's where you have the data. But it's a little bit of like looking under the lantern where the light is, as opposed to, are you actually tracking what's important? Which is why I ask you the question, what matters most? Most things like process doesn't have a lantern on top of it. So you would miss all that. The capacity requirements came out of multiple of these studies that we did. I mean, it's absolutely real. On the Hudson River, most of the villages are run by volunteers. No elected, no paid staff. Well, how are they going to do that, right? So what are the possibilities of working in such difficult circumstances? Probably here, there are multiple communities where that is too. One of the things we found is that, the indicators can be actionable information. If you know what's going on, it can be super, super helpful for your planning, for your decision-making, for your, fundraising, all the reasons that we mentioned. But oftentimes, stuff gets tracked that ends up on a shelf and nobody uses it, right? So can we do that better? Instead of thinking we have to measure 30 things, what about the 5 things that would really tell us what's going on? Even if that, is maybe slightly different from the 30 things we're already tracking. So a small set of purpose-driven, decision-relevant, meaningful indicators could make all the difference in this context. And then, I just simply want to say, sometimes people go through the motions because they're told to or they have to for job reasons, for funding reasons, not necessarily always really thinking about it. And what we learned in this whole process is that if you embed indicator development in the process of designing your projects, planning, stakeholder engagement, make it part of that process as opposed to the thing at the end, it makes your work better. Right now, it makes your work better because you think harder about, really, if we do this, it's going to do that? How is that really going to happen, right? So people become better strategic thinkers if it's embedded in their planning process. So I'll say one more thing about that and then introduce you to the toolkit, which is, what is it actually we're tracking? Is it, for example, that you want to track that an adapting entity like a commission or a planning department actually does what it said it would do, right? Is agency A doing what it said it would do? Or is politician B doing what she promised? That sort of thing. That gets at performance, right? Is it happening or is it not happening? That tends to be focused on, is the money being delivered or are they actually taking certain steps? So again, when you think about that, the sandwich diagram, a couple of the dimensions. The second one is, are you tracking the effectiveness of what you're doing? In other words, is it resulting in what you had in mind, what you hoped it would do? That one gets at, how well is it working? That can focus on the process, the actions you're taking, the outputs or the outcomes that you're producing. And then finally, is it enough, what we're doing? You know, you could be perfect in one project, but you've done it for one project and you have another 70 miles of coastline for which you haven't done anything. Great. Keep going is what I want to say, right? Or you could do it everywhere, but really badly. That gets more at the second one about the effectiveness, right? So you want to know some of each in this, but you want to be very careful. What is it exactly that we're trying to get at? So, all right, let me take you to this toolkit. So basically, we took the lessons that I shared with you and turned that into a step-by-step process so you can develop your own tailored, works for your town, for your project, for your thing. Not a set of standard, like, you know, thou shalt always measure wetland restoration in X way. No, can't do that because a wetland in California and a wetland here in Massachusetts don't work quite the same way, you know? So if you're looking for the standard answers, I'm not the one to tell you those. However, we do have a lot of examples in our toolkit even for you to search for them. So it basically integrates what we learned, provides a lot of tools, job aids, and by what I mean, basically, if you wanted to engage your community in a visioning process to find out what's the success for our community, here is a way to do that. If you wanted to, you know, become more efficient at how you measure the data because you don't have enough money, here's how to do that. Like that's what I mean by a job aid. And then we have, you know, we highlight the examples from the NEARs just so you kind of see step by step how did we go about that. We also just developed the toolkit by literally working with people like yourselves from the NEARs and from their communities to kind of hear, what do you want from a toolkit? We had a previous version and they said, yeah, that's not quite good enough. So we redesigned it to make sure that it actually answers the questions they have. So here it is. And you're welcome to follow along. I'll walk you through it right now just to show you what's there. And then I'm going to give you some time for you to just play with it, explore it. Maybe, you know, those of you who have computers can share your screen and look it up. But it's basically resiliencemetrics.org. Very easy. So this is the welcome page. What you'll find there, first of all, is what we found is really helpful is if people actually get a little bit of background, not like a long lecture or anything, but a little bit of background on adaptation, because they have to explain that to the people they work with, and they typically don't have that background. So what is adaptation resilience? What do we mean of success? I talked you through that. What is evaluation even? How do we define indicators versus metrics? I'll just quickly tell you that the indicator is the trait that points to what you want, whereas the metric is how you're actually measuring it. People use that exactly the opposite and all other ways. And, you know, so this is how we're using it here. We're using on our own work. We're using other people's work to provide examples, their testimonials, background information, contact information in case you need any help with it. But basically the idea is that you can use the drop-down menus, you can use the side menu that, you know, to navigate around, you can use indicator icons. I'll come back to that in a moment to show you. There's a Get Started page. There is an interactive tool to help you find where to go, depending on where you are. And there's, you know, basically an overview of the job aids in a resource page, and you just type in, I need help with this, or I need show me all the resource aids, all the job aids, whatever, and then you basically can get that. And a search bar if you look at it. So no matter where you enter into this, you're going to hopefully find what you need. So let me give you an example. If you clicked on this Getting Started menu, it would give you an introduction. This is what you see there. Why do we, a need for a common understanding introduces all the terms that we're using. The terminology is sort of a quick search thing. Basics on adaptation, getting help, and if you want to help, in other words, we have a case where we did that and we could put that up there, all as possible. So, you know, that's all in that drop down on the sidebar menu, same issue. Here's this interactive diagnostic tool, and you could maybe play with that later. I highly recommend it. So basically what what we came up with is there is sort of a 6-step process to developing and using indicators. And each one has a bunch of sub-steps. And these are listed here. So if I were to just now click on each one of these here, let's say I clicked on all 5, then we feel like you have done this step. Let me see if I can actually just do that. Oh, I can't do it here, but I can do it. Let me see if I just put it in here. Oh, am I not online? Great, resilience metrics. Oh yeah, missing an S, sorry. I can't spell sometimes. Okay, oh, come on. I am real. There we go. So if I go to the quiz right here, and I were to click on each one of these, because I've taken all these steps. For the first one, bounding and assessing your problem. Someone said this before in the Mentimeter, like drawing boundaries around your problem, right? What is it actually we're trying to measure? Something for all of Mashpee or for Barnstable County, or is it just for our little plot? That's important. So drawing boundaries. We have assessed our risks and vulnerabilities. We have clearly defined what our adaptation efforts will focus on. We have drawn sectoral and jurisdictional boundaries. We have all our stakeholders identified and all the right people around the table. If you've done all those things, great. Next, then you go to the next. If you don't, let's just say you've done only 2 of these things, what it tells you is, based on your response, we recommend you start at visioning success. And then you can go to indicator metrics where it says visioning success, and it will take you through the steps of the process here. So that's how this works, right? You can self-assess where you are and then find that step in the menu of indicators of how to develop that. So let me go back to this one here. Let's see. Oops. So let me just do that one more time here. In this instance. So let's say in that first one, you have just clicked on the first 3, and we recommend that you start with, or you want to know more about who are my stakeholders. You can click on that, help to achieve this. And what we have for you in this menu basically is a job aid about identifying and effectively engaging stakeholders and rights holders. If you don't know the difference, I'm happy to talk about that. We have case studies of how to do that. Who or what adapts is also helpful as a background information. And then resources, here is just a whole bunch of resources we can search for, say, community engagement, to bring the right stakeholders to you. So that's what you would find underneath that. And each one of those things, the job aids, all those things are printable. So you can basically have them as a facilitation agenda or as a background for what you do. So it's very practical in that way. Let me take you to the next step, walk through that. So depending on where you are in the process, let's say you're beginning a project, a design stage or something like that, you need help with visioning. You can find information, job aids, facilitation tools, examples of how other people have done that. And then you can see how each one of the typical planning process is sort of connected to the process of developing indicators. This is what I meant earlier when I said it's not just a thing you do at the end. It's not just, oh, tell me back, when I'm done with it, now how do I measure it? No, you embed the process of developing and coming up with them along the way as you go, so that by the time you get to using it, using the indicators, you know exactly how we got there, why you're having them, and how then to apply them and how to use them. So that's the idea, to not add, sort of a layer of an extra layer that doesn't help you with your process. What we've found in this is that the more people think about what are we trying to achieve, how do we get there, how do we bring everybody along, you get a much better adaptation or project development process. Here is some, you saw these earlier, these 5 reasons for why to think about them. And we have each of those written up with ideas of how do you communicate adaptation success? How do you use these in funding requests or whatever, right? So all of that is spelled out in more detail. Let me take you to a couple more things. So this is, taking you through the 6 dimensions that you saw in the hamburger sandwich. What do we want to know about each one of those? What would be useful to measure in each of those contexts? And then, comes this basically the process of exactly how do you develop them? How do you do each step that you see listed here? So these are the 6 steps: bounding and assessing your context, visioning success, exploring and identifying the metrics that you want, selecting a few because you might come up with 20, but you only have the bandwidth for maybe 6, right? Or whatever the case may be. And then how do you monitor them? How do you measure actually what you're wanting to go? And then what do you do with it, right? So for each one, there are stepwise discussions and descriptions of how to do that. There are case examples of how we did it and lists of indicators. So at least examples, right? It doesn't mean like you have to use those. It's just, this is the kind of stuff. Like, how do you measure social resilience? How do you measure ecological resilience? So we just give you a few examples, just so you maybe don't start from total blank page. And if you look in the resources, what have others used, you can get to other examples. Here is that list of, this is for social aspects, and what you see might be, let me see if I can point that out. So what you see on the top here is the adaptation strategy, an indicator for it, a way to measure it, and then what does it actually measure? Is it measuring the process, the capacity, the barrier overcoming, the decision-making, having taken an action, or the outcome? Like, what is it good for? And I would highly recommend that you have some of each, right? Because of that, keeping the eye on the entire process, on the entire beast, if you will. So maybe the example I'll show you in a moment from Alaska is what I thought was the most beautiful way of embedding indicators and metrics in people's plannings, processes, and documents. So basically aligning a strategy you have to address a certain problems with an indicator that would show you moving in the right direction, and here's how you measure it, and then it would address one of these dimensions. So there's more about the project I'm not going to talk much about at this moment, but just as an example, if you wanted to sort of get a sense of what did we in each of these places, you would see the workshop slides, you would get facilitation agendas, a public agenda, the case study written up, any facilitation tools we used, any job aids we used, and anything else, any other outputs that were produced from it. And then people you can contact even if you wanted to, oh, that sounds like us. Can I ask what's happening there in more detail? But that's what you would find in there as examples. On the resources side, you can search it simply by phrases, or you can say, I want all the job aids. Just click on that and press enter, and you'll get the whole list, right? So it's different ways to search it depending on what you need. Let me walk through this here. You can search by topic. You can search by sector. It's like, want everything that has to do with urban or with water or with agriculture, whatever. And let's see, region, that might not be as relevant to you right now. And is it from our work or is it from other people's work? So I just want to give you a little bit of time. Let's see what time we have. Let's just give it 5 minutes or so for you, so we can wrap it up after that. If you want to just play with it a little bit, maybe the quiz is the right place, or anything that else you want to poke around with. And if you have questions, we'll have time for that, but feel free to just raise your hands and we'll have somebody come run with a microphone to you. So let me show you an example of one of the communities in which we developed indicators. And I'll give you the example of Homer, Alaska, which was one of the places where there is a near, like we have here. The way we started this in terms of like how to get to indicators, and there's many different ways to do that, is that we actually started out with a visioning process, and then did some strategic planning of how might we get to that vision, and then attached or developed indicators and metrics that are attached to those strategies, and then developed metrics for each one of them. And I'll show you how that worked out. And maybe to give you the larger context, at the time when we were working with them, NOAA had just come in as, coastal zone management of NOAA. That program actually offers capacity building workshops to communities to just help them. What does adaptation mean? How do you go about it? And they had just done that. So the community had sort of a basic understanding. The planners were familiar, could, figure out how to connect that to the other planning processes that they had going on, like general planning, comprehensive plan updates, or hazard mitigation planning. So we attended that, and we gave a little bit of a talk about sort of, what does successful adaptation mean? That happened before we got there. And then when we got there, we basically said, let's just start with the idea of developing a vision of success, and then we basically tested that, stress tested it, if you will, against climate scenarios, and developed this idea of how do you get there from here to there? What are the steps you need to take along the way? That didn't go anywhere, quite frankly. It was way too abstract. And what happened in the meantime between these workshops, that people had concrete problems happening, roads eroding, or water pipes breaking, or literally there was a boat leaking oil in the harbor, the iconic example. Anyway, so they had to deal with these acute problems, and then we just decided, okay, let's just take that concrete problem. How would you solve it? And would it work under the different climate scenarios that you're getting, right, that are possible for that region? And there's uncertainty about it. So basically it was a stress test about which of these strategies to deal with your very concrete problems would actually work no matter what the climate might be. And once we identified those, then we identified the indicators and metrics to it. So here's an example of that. So the climate scenarios, the visioning, that was the initial work. And then we had that current problem, and they identified a whole bunch of strategies to deal with them. And then we said, would they work, right? That was sort of the next steps. And once we had those, we developed the indicators and then the metrics. So one concrete example I want to give you is Homer is at the end of the Kenai Peninsula. And essentially, there's one road that goes to Anchorage, and one way for food to come into the community, other than, people going and fishing a bunch of fish and picking berries. But other than that, all the food comes from that one road. Super big vulnerability. So what do we do to address that? Well, they didn't have the control in Homer to deal with keeping the roads maintained and upgraded and whatever. That's the state, right? So they decided food security is a really big issue in part of their in their local vision. They need a local seed bank to essentially grow food right where they are, so it doesn't require that road. What would we do to get to that seed bank? Those were the indicators tied to the different, to that particular strategy. And then how would we actually measure it? Is the eco map what's possible to grow here? Is that completed, yes or no, or in progress? Is there a seed library formed, yes or no, or in progress? Is anybody using the seed bank? That would be an important piece, right? The number of, or diversity of the patrons would be a way to measure that. Supportive legislation to support them to do that. Is that in place or in progress? How much acres are actually grown locally? And is there investment in the impact, the type and number of co-benefits from having a local seed bank, right? You can imagine the native peoples there and local hunters, fishers, whatever, would feel maybe pride in providing food for the community. So those are the kinds of measures. And I can tell you from the last bit here is that those indicators and metrics got embedded in their comprehensive plan. So they're policy now. So it got really implemented into the documents they deal with on a daily basis. It's not something that sits on the shelf. I won't go through this, but I want you to be aware of it. We applied the same approach with the resilience toolkit and that kind of approaches to develop resilience metrics for the state of Massachusetts. The only reason I want to mention that to you is you might want to look at what did they come up with, because they might give you a clue what you might measure. So it's aligned. Right? So we have very specific indicators and metrics for the state of Massachusetts. One quick thing to say, this comes back to the question of, is it working and are we doing enough? Imagine that green spot in the top where you do it really well and you do it everywhere. In that case, it's adequate and effective. If you do, it's not so great, but you do it in a lot of different places, maybe the point here is to invest more in making it better. When you have it in a few places only, but it's really good, the point would be to elaborate on it or to replicate it in other places. And if you haven't done anything or it's very small beginnings and it's not working, then that would be the investment there. So I'm not going to go through this, it's too much, but the point of that is simply it helps you, having these indicators helps you assess what do we need to do depending on how well it's working and how much we have done. So I think I'll just have to stop here because I get the sign. So I'm happy to share with you. Let me see if there's a contact information. If you want to have the slides, I'm happy to share those with you. Or if you want to just ask me other questions that we don't have time for right now, I'm also going to be here through the afternoon still. So happy to answer more questions. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Susie. We have time for one question before we break for lunch.
All right.
Right over here.
How long does it take a group to move through the visual pit on average?
How long does it take to, on average, for a group to move through the
Well, it
toolkit?
depends really where they start, but in terms of the Homer group, as an example, those 3 workshops, that was about a 16-month process. It probably there were a few extra months to get it voted in or adopted as the new plan. I didn't count that, but the 3 workshops that we did, that was about 16 months. So not super long, but also not like this. You have to. People in Alaska are busy in the summer. You don't get to do anything with them in the summer. So,
Susie,
Yes.
one more related question, and you can answer quickly with maybe yes or no, but probably maybe elaborate a tiny bit. Are there any successful examples of cutting corners where you are excited to do this process but recognize there's limitations, and sort of can you speak to resources that you might have to help us when we're already down the train's going down the track and we want to engage a little bit, but we can't do everything?
yes. So you might start small as a first, like just to test it. That would be one way to at least get basically you lead with success, right? We have a whole section in there about efficiencies in, like, if I don't have resources, how do I get there, right? So you spread the work, you build partnerships so other people can help you with it. You don't have to do it all yourself, but some other people might do pieces of it that are relevant. I think there are pieces that I wouldn't skimp on, like building trust, building good relationships. Those would be more important to maintain. But I don't think there's any problem with you either outsourcing some pieces or sharing the responsibility for tracking certain things, or doing them in partnership with others, and starting small. Like I'd rather you do a little bit really well than to have a long process that everybody's dissatisfied with, and then why bother picking that up again? So you want to put your strongest foot forward. I don't think there is a this isn't important to measure, this is not. When I asked you earlier, I'll say that in the closing with the complexity, the most important things in change in complex problems is the relationships. So that's why I say don't skip on that one.
Thank
Hope
you
that's
very
helpful.
much. And I will also mention that the training and engagement program at Waquoit Bay is here to kind of help you through and assist in these types of processes as well. So let's thank Susie one more time, and then I have an announcement.